Hi guys, and welcome back. Today, let's talk about one of the things that makes watercolors so unique as far as art mediums and a little bit on how to utilize that. So one of the things that makes watercolors so special is that it is transparent. And what you can do with that is you can glaze with it. So if you've used watercolors much, you're probably at least a little aware of glazing, but a quick recap, glazing is just the layering of transparent watercolor washes on top of each other so that you get this layered effect. The light actually travels through each layer of color and it just creates such a vibrancy and life to the painting that you just cannot achieve any other way. It's really incredible to see it in person. Oh, and a really quick caveat, when you're glazing, make sure that the lower layer is bone dry, completely dry before you add another layer. So glazing is one of the cornerstones of watercolors, but it's not something that I've always given as much focus on. It's one of the things that if you take a watercolor class, they really drive home at the beginning. They show you how to create different colors simply by taking different pigments and layering them together. So like a blue and a pink to create a purple rather than mixing a purple on your palette and then painting it in one wash. And when you do that, and I highly recommend that you do try that out and experiment with it, but if you have a side-by-side of a pre-mixed purple and a glazed purple, you can see the difference, and I think that that is absolutely fascinating. Now, it's important to be able to understand how they look and how they behave so that you can control it. I find that there are a lot of uses that I still have for mixing the precise color that I want and then applying it to my paper in one wash, as opposed to layering it over time with glazes. So one of the questions that I like to ask myself if I'm deciding how much I want to lean on glazing as opposed to a glazing hybrid is how specific do I need that color? So if I do not need it to be exact, precise, and I can kind of let the watercolors play a little bit and do their own thing, then I like to really just let the glazing shine. So for example, in this painting, the background, it's very abstract. It's just kind of hinting at an environment and I'm really playing with the textures a lot. That's where I really let the glazing shine. I let myself just have a lot of fun with the differences in each layer. So that first wash I did with, it was a single paint from Daniel Smith, but it's a really heavily granulating one. I believe it was under sea green. And it is gorgeous. So yeah, it granulates a lot. So it has a lot of pigments that separate and create a lot of division on its own. So I used that paint alone and I created a lot of texture and I let it dry. And then I created another wash that had other pigments mixed together. I think it was mostly like a turquoise, an actual turquoise. And it just makes it feel so vibrant. It brings out the jewel tones and it helps enhance some of those greens underneath, but because that base layer was so much greener and then the glaze that I did on top of it was a lot more blue, it just like melds together into this teal color. But when you're looking at it in person, you can see so much of those different pigments shining through. So yeah, when I'm working on things like that or like clothing that can be really varied like that, it can be really fun to see how different I can make each layer. So like instead of trying to match a relatively green wash with another relatively green wash that might be just a little bit more of the shadow color, if that makes sense. If I'm doing something that can be a little bit more textured and free flowing of that, I can do, say, a more yellow color base and then more of a blue color on top of that. And then I end up with a green that's similar, but it has a lot more of the components that make glazing so beautiful. And again, this is one of those things that you just kind of have to see in person. When you see photographs, it still achieves a certain amount of that beauty to it. But when you see a watercolor in person that has glazing on it, it just is so luminous. And a very quick announcement, this will be my January Patreon print. So if you'd like to get a print of her, make sure to sign up for the print tier over on my Patreon by the last day of January. Thank you guys so much for all the support over on Patreon. You guys are absolutely incredible. You help me to be able to make these videos, so thank you. I also have the original painting available at my shop, so if you'd like the painting, she's called The Black Knife. That link is down below as well, so you can head over to my shop and check that out. Okay, so let's talk about when you want a very specific color. but you still want to get some of the luminosity of glazing. So I'm thinking very specifically about painting skin. There are other examples, and it can really vary depending on the pieces that you're painting on, but I tend to like to really make sure that I control how that is developing. So I will often start with a base layer for the skin in watercolors. I'll mix it up the way that I like so that it has the colors that I want in the undertone, and then I'll apply it on a scratch piece of paper, let it dry, make sure it's where I want it to be, and then I will paint the entire skin with that establishing base layer. And then after that, I can glaze on top of it with more pure pigments that will allow it to get that luminosity of the glazing, and I can really just have fun digging into the undertones and the highlights in the skin, but it still has been steered in the right direction from the very beginning. I find that helps me to be a lot happier with the result, but by no means is that the ideal way to do skin. It's just one of the options. So there are so many artists that do fully split up glazing for the skin. So they'll do a red layer and a yellow layer and then a blue layer for the shadows, and it becomes really vibrant and beautiful, and it has that quality that watercolors just really portray so well. So by no means feel like you need to limit it one way or the other. I like to do it very like a hybrid, where I can blend some of the things that I like the most about a mixed wash as well as the glazing in very simple colors. So again, I'll often create that base layer first, and then I usually go right into like a red so that I can establish some of the warmth in the skin, the areas where the blood is a little closer to the surface, so like in the cheeks, or if I've put any like scratches on the character, which I like to do often, or any areas like that, or like on the top of the shoulders or the collarbones. I just like to emphasize certain areas with a little bit more of a warmth, or like the ends of the fingers, those often are warmer. So anyways, I'll take a pink color, a purely pink glaze that on its own would be a bit unnatural, but it's very saturated and it glazes on top of that base layer very well. And then I'll add in the shadows, which are often a very blue, purple. They're very cool, and I love watching that come to life because I have that base layer there below it. It makes it feel much more lifelike and real, even though it's a very saturated, cool color that you wouldn't naturally find in skin. It just creates this amazing marriage between the two layers. And yeah, it's by far one of my favorite things about watercolors, is watching these colors transform together and create a very complex layering. One thing that I find that I wouldn't say struggle, that's a bit of a strong word, but one thing that I combat with often when I'm doing paintings that I glaze with is paints that are opaque or semi-opaque. They're not as friendly with the glazing process, which is probably obvious, especially for the top layers. So if you have a paint that is, say, semi-opaque, it's going to let less light shine through it to the layers below it. So that can be a consideration to think about how you're going to use it, do some test swatches of it. It can also reactivate kind of a lot if it's a base layer. So I found if I use a semi-opaque watercolor as a base layer, I let it completely dry, and then I do a glaze on top of it. If I'm not careful, it can reactivate and move those paints around so that I'll have like bald spots and then areas with more pigment. So it's no longer a smooth wash like it was before. That can be worked around. So I find that if I use a much softer brush and a softer touch with the glaze layer on top, I can keep that base layer somewhat undisturbed. This is just kind of a trial and error practice thing, especially with your own paints, with the paints that you own, so that you can try out that exact pigment and see how it reacts. So for me, I very often like to use I think it's English red ochre. I'm not sure. I'm gonna have to look it up. Anyways, there's a paint that's just beautiful for skin colors, but it is semi-opaque. So I like to use that as the base layer first and only, and I establish that, and then I just do very careful washes so that I try not to disturb that layer underneath. That's also something that I thought about as I did the background for this. So I used Daniel Smith Undersea Green, and that is very pigmenting. pigmenting, granulating, there we go. But it also has some opaque pigments in it. So I was very careful as I laid the glaze on top of it to not scrub at what was below it, to be very gentle, to almost just like set to lay that glaze on top of it, that turquoise glaze, rather than really just rubbing the brush over what was already there. That's also especially important if you want to preserve a texture, if you don't want to disrupt what you've already placed down, which I really wanted to preserve that. That was something that I loved about the paint that I used in that first wash. So yeah, just things to be aware of, to pay attention to. If you're using a more opaque paint, it can reactivate. Be aware of that. Another very important tool is just a scratch piece of paper. I would recommend this for any type of painting that you're using pigments like this for anyways, but when it's glazing, it's really helpful to be able to lay down each layer and then see how your new wash will blend with what's below it. So this helps you make sure that you have the water to paint ratio correct, that it's not too saturated or dark for what you're trying to achieve, or that it's not too light and you're missing out on the pigment that you need. So yeah, I just keep a scratch piece of paper next to me the whole time. I do a lot of glazes of the washes that I am using. So if I'm doing a base skin color, for example, I'll do a couple patches of that. That way, if I change or adjust what colors I'm layering on top of it, I can use a new square and just compare those out and then add each new layer on top of it. It saves a lot of heartache. I highly recommend this. There have been so many paintings in the past that I have messed up because I didn't do little test swatches first, and then there's been so many that I have saved because I did just have that little scratch piece of paper next to me. And I'm gonna give a little plug for one of my all-time favorite watercolor tools, and that's an embossing gun. So this is used in like card making, stamp making. Use it with like embossing powder traditionally, but what it is, it's just this little device that shoots hot air, kind of like a hair dryer, except it's very condensed and it's a lot hotter. So what that does is it dries the paper much faster. So if you're using a hair blow dryer, which a lot of people do, I recommend trying out an embossing gun. It keeps the paints from moving around as much. It keeps it kind of located where it is, and then it dries out, and then you can paint on top of it. The reason why I love it for glazing is I often do a lot of smaller layers on top, like a ton of layers. And if I had to wait for every single one to dry, I would just go crazy. And I hate hopping around all over the painting waiting for areas to dry. Like when I don't have access to my embossing gun, it doesn't go as smoothly, and I don't get the effects that I want as well because I'm more distracted. Anyways, that's a bit of a tangent. The point is, this is a great tool. Highly recommend it if you're doing watercolors at all. It just makes the whole process more enjoyable because you can just stay in the flow state working on it rather than waiting for paint to dry. And I'd say my final little tip is glazing can create such incredibly interesting things. I highly recommend just sitting down and doing some practice glazes, seeing what very different pigments do together, what say completely contrasting complementary colors can do when you glaze them together. You'll probably get a very interesting and dynamic neutral color that when you look close, you see a lot of life to it. It doesn't look empty or dead like a just plain black pigment can look, but it still has that neutrality to it. You can also mix things that are a lot more analogous. I love what you can do with glazing, and I've been trying to do more just practice things where I can throw down different colors together and see what they look like and have that in my arsenal as I'm planning out my paintings to know if I mix these colors together in several layers, I'm gonna get this effect and it's exactly what I want. So yeah, just play with it. Have fun with your watercolors. So yeah, stay tuned for some more glazing specific videos as well as some other watercolor technique videos coming up. I'd like to dig more into that again. I love learning more about the technique using watercolors. I'd love to show some of those things that I am relearning and reacquainting myself with. So anyway, stay tuned. Again, the print will be available as the tier print over on Patreon for January. So if you'd like that, make sure to sign up by the last day of January. There's a link down in the description that'll take you over there. And the original painting is looking for a home. So if you'd like to give the Black Knife a new home, there's a link in the description that'll take you over to my shop and you can check that out. And that is it. So thank you guys so much for watching. Thank you to all of my incredible patrons over on Patreon, and I'll see you guys next time.